We are going to have our regular weekly update on Israel and the Middle East. And one of our favourite voices on Vision is back in the studio. I know many people will be happy to hear her voice, and it is the one and only Mandy Worby.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good, Mandy. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's nice to be back.
It's nice to have you back, Mandy. It feels like, you know what the Chinese say, that sense of harmony. The universe is in order. When Mandy Worby is here.
There would be some who would disagree severely with that.
But Mandy, obviously the world news cycle right now is just fixated on Trump and the attempted assassination, which was just, it's one of the biggest news events, I think, for the next 20 years at least.
Yeah.
But Israel is still engaged in its fight for survival.
Yes,
we're not seeing a lot of it in the media right now because of the focus on America.
Sure.
So let's talk about Israel and the Middle East. What is happening in Israel right now, Mandy?
Well, I just want to actually focus on something that you mentioned. You mentioned the assassination attempt on President Donald Trump. Now, you know, the election's coming up on November 5, and there has been a massive effort over the years to really undermine him using some very inflammatory and dangerous rhetoric. I mean, even President Biden used the words that President Trump or Donald Trump needs to be in the bullseye, and then I think it was less than a week later there is an attempt. I'm not saying Biden is responsible for that. The shooter is responsible for what he did, and only the shooter. But it is true that there's a great deal of rhetoric that is inflammatory, and not everybody is sensible enough or calm enough to not go down that road. So it was pretty bad. I mean, there is a website. I'm just trying to think of the name of it. There's a website that I went to. It'll come to me in a minute. But it was talking about how hateful, Brookings.edu, how hateful rhetoric connects to real-world violence. And that's absolutely true. So we're all, as you said, the whole world is fixated on what happened to President Trump or former President Trump. But what has been happening to President Trump has been happening to Benjamin Netanyahu for years. Exactly the same kind of rhetoric. They've tried to prevent him from running in elections. They've tried to have him ousted from elections. They've tried to undermine his government. They've brought court cases against him for so-called corruption. Nothing has stuck. Now, they've been, just in recent years, they've been putting up posters, not only of Donald Trump and having him made to look like Adolf Hitler, which is sickening, but they've had pictures of Bibi's face up with bloodied red handprints on his face, as though all the bloodshed is all on Bibi, right? The very fact that they want to have him up on war crimes and, you know, international arrest warrants and things like that, which is abhorrent.
Yeah, so for our listeners, Netanyahu obviously is a conservative leader.
Yes, he is.
And so he's copping the same amount of heat and criticism and hate.
He's conservative. It's the very far left. I mean, just recently there was a video on social media, and I quote to you, they were saying, "Benjamin and Sarah Netanyahu, we are coming for you. We will drag you from your fortress. The police barricades won't help you," end quote. That's appalling. It is absolutely appalling. So the activists and agitators, they've been setting fires to roads, surrounding his premises, shutting down whole city sections. It's very dangerous language. Now, in America, they're saying, we need to bring this rhetoric down, tone it down. It'll be interesting to see if something happens in Israel to stop it, or for people who are inciting. Israel and many countries are very fierce about protecting freedom of speech, but freedom of speech that is actually dangerous and calling for death or harming of other people, that's actually not protected under freedom of speech. But nobody wants to deal with the rhetoric, but they're going to have to do something. So let's watch that space and see what happens.
Well, it's a really interesting conversation, Mandy, because I think it's a sign of the times that I honestly believe people are not as well read and as intelligent as they were 100 years ago. If you read diaries and letters and books written 100 years ago, people had incredible vocabulary and understanding of grammar and language and words. And today, it just feels like people have become so simple that the only way they can win an argument is by hurling abuse at the other party and criticising them.
It's all about the inflammatory rhetoric, and the more inflammatory it is, the greater your capacity to win your side of the argument. But you don't win an argument that way. You just show yourself to be, let's just say, uneducated. Yeah. Let's put it that way. Uneducated and foolish, because that's why so many cities are on fire at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like modern comedians. Like, they have to use F-bombs and swear words to get a laugh now, and that's a cheap laugh.
Yeah.
But to make someone laugh without swearing and being crass is actually a real art.
Yes,
and
it
it
is.
requires intelligence and a real skill. And in the old days, and I sound old, Mandy, I'm so young, but in the old days, comedians were funny and TV shows were funny without crudity and nudity and swear words and without being crass. And it really took skill to do that. And it's sort of the same with the modern media and the modern political spectrum, that people are just being really crass and simplistic in their attempts to prove their point.
I know. But they're just driven by blind ideologies, and they're not even open to a conversation to say, why do you hold this view? Not open to any discussion at all, which is kind of tragic.
So BB's copying it as well. So watch this space. I hope that the heat is reduced on him, but I don't know. Knowing human nature, I think it's going to be back on Trump within 2 weeks as well. But let's talk about the security bullet points as well, Mandy. What's going on in the north of Israel?
Yeah, in the last 40, Hezbollah is the threat in the north, and for the last 48, every day for months now, they have been lobbing masses of rockets. So that is still continuing daily. There was just a couple driving their car the other day, direct hit. They're both killed in northern Israel. Kiryat Shmona, which is it's just south of Metula in the very north, they have been absolutely copping it. They've had buildings damaged and destroyed, businesses. Most of the north of Israel is evacuated. People can't go back to their homes. So that's continuing. And as we've mentioned before, we've talked about the fires that are raging. It's decimating the countryside. And it's the peak of summer. So it's a very, very dangerous time. But that is ongoing. So the last 48 hours has been pretty bad. There was a terrorist shooting overnight, Judea, Samaria. 3 injured. They're looking for the terrorist. There's also been a possible infiltration into Eilat in the south. Don't know the result of that just yet. And there's also, again, this is not confirmed, but there's a report, came out on CNN. So anyway, it's just unconfirmed that is possibly Hamas may be at breaking point, and that Yahya Sinwar, who actually masterminded October 7, is now being pressured by some of his generals because they're at the end of this. They need to do something about coming up with accepting a peace plan because they're on their last legs. I can only pray that this is the case because we want to see an end to this war. So we'll see.
Interesting CNN to report that because, as we know, CNN have a real left-wing bias and
they do.
An anti-Israel agenda. Yeah. So I wonder why that information is being leaked.
Well, they say apparently, again, this is unconfirmed, but they're saying that they have a source close to Hamas. That I find concerning, that they have a source close to Hamas, but again, it's an unconfirmed report. I just throw that out there into the ether. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, and also in Gaza, Hamas again found using a UNRWA building as a base. Now, what's UNRWA?
The UNRWA, UNRWA. Okay, that is, there are 2 aid agencies in the United Nations that look after refugees. One is the UNHCR, and they look after all the refugees in the world. And then there's the UNRWA, UNRWA. They only look after the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, and it's basically run by Palestinians and many Hamas members. And it's supposed to be neutral because it's the UN, but every single UN building or UNRWA building in Gaza, as the IDF has got there, has been found to be used by Hamas, as has every single hospital so far, as has schools and you name it, anything civilian, hospitals, ambulances, all used by Hamas. So another one, they've just gone into another one and they've had to deal with the threat of Hamas terrorists in there. Of course, all of the civilians were evacuated first. The other thing is that as the Gazans have been moving, the IDF have been moving south, which was the furthest south was the Rafah border, the Philadelphia corridor. Palestinians started moving back to northern Gaza, and so did Hamas, because Hamas always stays with the civilians to embed themselves among them. And so the IDF are having to go back into northern Gaza, and they've asked the civilians to, again, move to safer ground so that they can deal with the ongoing threat of Hamas. Hamas are just relentless, and they always stay amongst civilians, because the greater the civilian casualty, the more they can beat Israel over the head with that in international media. And also, there have been so many tunnels. You've heard of the London Underground. It's about 250 kilometres worth of tunnels. That is nothing compared to the tunnel structure, which is just like a honeycomb of tunnels underneath the whole of Gaza. And so they're constantly finding more tunnels, and it's shocking. Some of them are, 2, 3, 4 city blocks long, kilometres long. And once they're cleared and sorted out, then the IDF go in and they destroy them, they blow them up so they can't be used again. Sadly, there are a lot of entry points to these tunnels. Most of the entry points have been found inside personal domestic homes and dwellings, civilian buildings, UNRWA offices, you name it, that's where the entrances are. Which means when you destroy the tunnel underneath, you're destroying buildings over the top. Once you make a tunnel or a building part of a terrorist infrastructure for use, it's no longer considered untouchable. It's now a military target, and Hamas is responsible for that.
It's a nightmare, isn't it?
Really is.
It's an absolute nightmare for the Israeli military to try and conduct this war without, like you said, any civilian casualties. And you've only got to look at the incompetence, and I'm going to say incompetence of the US Secret Service in protecting, former President Trump, that they couldn't keep a guy off a roof 130 metres away. Well, imagine any military is going to make mistakes. They're not always going to get things right. And to be fighting a war where your enemies are fighting amongst civilians and they've got tunnel entrances in people's homes, it's such a challenge, isn't it?
Well, you know what's interesting, Andrew, is you've got the whole world is watching Israel and condemning Israel, but also military strategists from all the countries of the world are going, we want to watch and learn what you do because you're conducting a war that nobody else has ever conducted, above ground, underground, with media pressure, the whole world's pressure, and you're having to do it hand-to-hand combat in order to save civilians.
Yeah,
and they're watching it closely because they're going to want to learn while condemning Israel at the same time.
Yeah, and I think, the IDF are known worldwide, aren't they, as one of the best militaries in the world.
Yeah,
so if anyone can do it, they'll do it.
Yep.
But let's also talk about that there, Middle Eastern nations tend to say that they publicly are in favour of a two-state solution and the Palestinians have the right to self-determination. However, their actions say something completely different.
Yeah, there's been several instances, actually, Andrew, where you know how in all of our campuses and all the street marches in the cities have been shut down by the protests, everybody's wearing keffiyeh scarves and Free Palestine and all that. It was interesting, in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, there is the New York University, NYU Abu Dhabi campus. And there was a young American student who walked up on the stage to get his graduation certificate and wearing a keffiyeh and yelled Free Palestine. Well, he was arrested and he was deported back to the States.
Wow.
And before this ceremony, in that college campus, they were told there will be no cultural symbols, there will be no cultural clothing, there will be no slogans, there will be no posters, there will be no flags or banners, not allowed on campus. And everybody's saying, yeah, but what about free speech? Well, NYU Abu Dhabi has had no violence. They've had no destruction to their property. They've had no targeting of any particular groups. They're putting a lid on it. And it's interesting because a similar thing happened in Morocco. There was, which is another Muslim nation, the Dean of the Faculty of Sciences in Casablanca, he refused to award a certificate of merit to a student because she was wearing a Palestinian keffiyeh. He asked her to take it off. She said no, and the result was he turned her back on her and walked off the stage. Even in recently during the Hajj in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, recently, a woman stood before the Kaaba, that's the big black box that they all march around as part of their, service and worship. And she took out a Palestinian flag to have a photograph with it, and she was immediately arrested by Saudi Arabian soldiers and arrested, and the flag was confiscated. So there are riots and protests in the street in behalf of Palestinians in Gaza, in places like in Turkey, which is Muslim, in Egypt, which is Muslim, but in many, many Muslim countries, they won't have a bar of it. And it's and you kind of have to ask the question, why?
What does this say? Yeah, what does this say, Mandy?
Well, what it's saying is that there are a lot of Muslim nations. That's why they won't take any of them in. You think, why? You love them so much. Why? Actually, they don't. They don't have any love in their heart for the Palestinians because they're so radicalised. We've talked about it before. From cradle to grave, they're radicalised to hate and to embrace violent jihad. And all of the Muslim nations around them don't want them a part of their nations. They don't want. But the one thing that unifies the Muslim world is a joint hatred of Israel. So they will jump on the Palestinian cause to beat Israel over their head with it, but when it comes to actually helping the Palestinians, they won't do it and they want to crush it. So the Palestinian cause is really just an opportunity to hurt Israel, but they're actually not really caring for the Palestinians themselves.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing. Yeah. Mandy, I could talk to you for hours about this, but we're going to have to wrap it up.
No worries.
But I want to thank you for joining us in the studio today, and so
Pleasure.
good to have you back. Mandy Worby with another update from Israel and the Middle East here on Vision.